Hello everyone, welcome to Gary's Math Help. This is the first of several videos on the topic of mnemonics. We have more of Higby's excellent book to do. The first 6 chapters explained the processes of memory, how it works, why it doesn't sometimes, various principles for remembering virtually anything, and how to apply these principles as study skills in school. Higby now has 8 more chapters on mnemonics, and we will discuss 6 of these. I'm skipping the chapter on names and faces because it's not directly applicable to most college course material. So, let's dive in. Mnemonics consists of a variety of techniques and systems to make it easier to remember things. The word comes from a Greek word meaning memory, and of course that Greek word came from an Indo-European word that has entered English in literally hundreds of other words. The original meaning of the Indo-European word men meant literally anything that could rouse the mind, which could be thinking or remembering, but also such things as love or madness or prophecy. Some of these words I've given here deserve a little more attention. Amnesia has what's called an alpha privative, which basically means an A or AN prefix making the word negative. So amnesia is a state of having no memory, just as asymmetry means no symmetry, and agnostic means someone who has no knowledge of whether God exists or not. Mind comes to us from Old English, while mental and reminisce come from Latin words. Mantra is a Sanskrit word that literally means something you think with, and Mandarin is a derivative of that word through Portuguese, referring to someone with the sort of advice that a mantra might give. The original Mandarins were advisors in the Chinese government. If you can guess what color their ceremonial robes were, then you probably know why a certain fruit is called a mandarin as well. Mentor is another Greek word that also means a particular kind of advisor, and a good mentor might admonish you. And of course, a maniac is someone who thinks obsessively about a particular thing. So you see all these MN combinations. That's a lot of words from this root, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens more. One other word that has this MN stem in it is the name of the Greek goddess of memory, pronounced Mnemosyne in modern English, with the initial M silent, but pronounced something like Mnemosyne in ancient Greek. There are some really interesting stories told about her. This in the picture is an ancient mosaic depiction of her that I really don't know much about. And this is a much more modern painting, about 150 years old, by the Italian master Dante Gabriel Rossetti. You might notice that she has an oil lamp, which is of course symbolic, because if you can remember something, then it certainly throws some light on the subject. One more painting and one more story about Mnemosyne. This painting is from 1727 by the Dutch artist Jacob de Witt, and you could go and see it if you're willing to travel to Amsterdam. Mnemosyne is the heavy-set gal in white and blue, and the fellow talking to her is Zeus, disguised as a shepherd. And what's Zeus doing? What he always does around attractive females. He's seducing her, of course. He stayed with her for 9 nights, and so, of course, she had 9 daughters. You may have heard of them. They're the 9 muses of Greek mythology, the goddesses of creative inspiration. You can look all of that up if you're more interested. But I should mention here that this seduction is a little worse than you think, because Mnemosyne is actually Zeus's aunt. She was the daughter of Gaia and Uranos, in other words, heaven and earth, so she was one of the Titans. Most Titans didn't get much worship or even attention, but Mnemosyne was a little different. For one, she's invoked in the first lines of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, helping the blind poet Homer to remember the stories he's about to tell. Socrates also invokes her in one of the Platonic dialogues before he tells a story. Besides this, there were prayers to her as part of a religious ritual to Asclepius, the god of healing. The idea was that if you were really sick back in those days, you could go and pray to Asclepius and then sleep in a special room at his temple, and you would have a dream about how to be cured. That's how they did medical research, right? The prayer to Mnemosyne beforehand was just to guarantee that you would remember the dream. This makes sense to me because I dream a lot, but I almost always forget my dreams about 3 seconds after I wake up in the morning. Maybe I should start praying to Mnemosyne, or maybe I don't want to remember my dreams. And anyway, the reason I wanted to mention the Muses, besides the fact that they're daughters of Mnemosyne, and important in their own right, is that I want you to notice that symbolically, the Greek myth is saying that creativity comes from memory. Besides that, the word muse itself also comes from the same Indo-European word for thinking or remembering, with that MN root, after undergoing a few linguistic processes to change the way it looks and sounds. And by the way, if you want to worship the 9 muses in a temple dedicated to artistic and creative endeavors, well, you'll end up going to a museum. And if you're more interested in hearing good songs inspired by the muses, then you should definitely listen to some music, an adjective that literally means relating to the muses. And finally, if you feel inspired by the muses to honor them in art, comprised of many small pieces of colored rock, like this example from the 1st century BC, then you can make your own mosaic, another word besides museum and music that also comes from the Greek word that gave us muse. And one more tidbit. While Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory, and the muses are her daughters, the ancient Greek poet Hesiod claimed that the muses actually cause forgetting. The idea here is that the various arts inspired by the muses cause us to forget our various pains. Nowadays, we would say that people who binge watch TV shows are escapists, but it's the same idea. So, why do we need mnemonics if we know the general principles of memory? Well, mnemonics are more specific than those principles. If you recall, 2 of the basic principles of memory that we learned about in earlier chapters were organization and meaning. Sometimes it's hard to find the organization and meaning in material that we have to learn, and the power of mnemonics is that they can be used to add those qualities, and that's how they work to make remembering easier. So, let's start looking at some examples of mnemonics. Mnemonics can be of 2 types, verbal or visual. Verbal mnemonics are usually more specific, and visual mnemonics are usually more general. Because of this distinction, Higby refers to verbal mnemonics as mnemonic techniques, and he refers to visual mnemonics as mnemonic systems. This seems like a good way to divide up various mnemonics, so I'll use those terms here myself. Sorry, I'm a math professor, so I do have to start with something like this, but at least it's nothing new. One verbal mnemonic that you all already know is PEMDAS, for the order of operations in an algebraic expression. The initial letters of the words are organized into the made-up word PEMDAS, and then for those who need a little more, an elaboration is added to create the phrase, "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally." This shows how a mnemonic can add organization and meaning to a pretty abstract concept. A few more verbal mnemonics to give us an idea of how they work. Here's Minnetonka Cave in Bear Lake Valley down in southeast Idaho. If you go there and see those beautiful rock formations, you might wonder, which are the stalactites and which are the stalagmites? The way I learned it as a boy was that stalactites, spelled with the letter C, come down from the ceiling, which also starts with a C, and the stalagmites, spelled with the letter G, come up from the ground, which starts with a G. So there you go. Next, what about daylight savings time? In most states of the U.S. and a few foreign countries, we have to set our clocks behind or ahead an hour in the spring and the fall, but a lot of people aren't sure which way to adjust. The verbal mnemonic for this is spring forward, fall back. So in the spring, move the clock an hour forward, and in the fall, move the clock an hour back. Spring forward, fall back. It just makes sense to say it that way because we have those phrases in English already. The mnemonic has imposed order on this abstract idea. And another verbal mnemonic that you might already know, although lately I've noticed that people my age all know this one, but most younger people have never heard it. Some months have 31 days, some have 30, and one has only 28 or sometimes 29, so how can we keep track? Again, when I was a boy, I was taught a little poem. 30 days hath September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except February something something. I was always a little annoyed because it no longer had the rhythm or rhyme of a good poem, the way my mother used to say it. Anyway, this little ditty dates all the way back to the 16th century, and there are actually older versions, even some in Latin, which of course are much older, and in fact the one I learned, the one my mother misquoted, did have two last lines about February that did indeed rhyme. But I don't use this little mnemonic poem anymore. I've been around enough that I just know how many days are in a month without having to think about it. Besides, I don't think this is a particularly good mnemonic, and it's been satirized as 30 days hath September and all the rest I can't remember. If I had to teach a young person nowadays, I would use the knuckle system, which some of you know, but of course I couldn't include that here as an example of a verbal mnemonic. And the webcomic XKCD has their own issue with this mnemonic. One very common technique shared by a number of verbal mnemonics is the use of the first letters from a list of items. For example, we've already seen PEMDAS. Another common example that some of you probably know is the supposed name Roy G. Biv, where the letters of the name are the first letters of the colors of the rainbow. If you play an instrument that uses a treble clef, then you probably learned the notes on the staff with "Every good boy does fine," or something like that. And any of you who have had a course in trigonometry probably learned this first letter mnemonic to memorize the ratios for the various trigonometric functions. You can say it like some native chant, so ka toa, but I prefer to remember it with some old hippie caught another hippie tripping on acid. Why do these first letter mnemonics work so well? For one thing, as we've already mentioned, the mnemonics add meaningfulness. The colors of the rainbow are just a bunch of colors, but when we put them in order and make a man's name out of them, they're more than that. Chunking means that we take many small parts and meld them into just one easier whole. Again, with Roy G. Biv, instead of having to remember 7 different colors in a particular order, we can just remember one man's name. Also, first letter mnemonics change a recall task, which is hard, to an aided recall task, which is much easier. It's like getting a hint for the retrieval process from long-term memory. One other help that first letter mnemonics provide is that they tell us how many things we're supposed to remember. If I count the letters of Roy G. Biv, I automatically know that there are 7 colors in the rainbow, and that can also help me remember them or at least let me know whether or not I've succeeded at it. The idea of keyword mnemonics is quite old, but wasn't named or written about in the academic literature until 1975. It was developed by two Stanford researchers named Atkinson and Raw, who were trying to come up with a better way for students to memorize foreign language vocabulary. Their idea of keyword mnemonics used a two-step process. In the first verbal step, the memorizer would find a sound-alike word called the keyword, and in the second visual step, the memorizer would associate that keyword to the meaning of the foreign word. If you're taking notes on this lecture, jot this stuff down because it's very important. Here's an actual example from that research article that was published in the journal American Psychologist. I just clipped out this picture. Suppose you're learning Spanish, and you learn that the Spanish word for duck is pato. The word pato sounds a little like the English word pot, so we use pot for the keyword. We then need to associate the English word pot with the idea of a duck, so we close our eyes and let our imaginations roam about, and we get the idea of a duck wearing a pot on its head. Later, when someone asks us the Spanish word for duck, we think of that silly image and get the keyword pot, which then reminds us of the Spanish word pato. Simple, huh? Well, maybe not, but we'll come back to this a little later. Let's see if we can't generalize what we're seeing here with these various mnemonics. The first basic principle, one which we've already mentioned before, is the added meaningfulness given to the material by the mnemonic. This is also probably the most important of these 5 principles we're about to list. Another basic principle we've already mentioned is the organization imposed on the material by the mnemonic. The idea of association is one that we have just seen with keyword mnemonics, and this idea is central, as we will see later that all of the general mnemonic systems we study will depend on association. Good visualization is something else we just saw while talking about keyword mnemonics, and we will have quite a discussion soon on the importance of effective visualization and how it contributes to association. And the last basic principle here is attention. Creating a mnemonic requires us to pay special attention to whatever we are trying to memorize, making the process more interesting and perhaps more fun. Now, if you're feeling a sense of deja vu here, it's because these are the basic principles of memory from Chapter 4 of Higby's book. And spoiler alert, these 4 points are the more basic principles of memory from Chapter 5, so again, we have already seen how these principles contribute to memory. First of all, repetition is still a good thing, and overlearning still helps retain memories. Another Chapter 5 principle was that of interference, and you'll be happy to know that interference is generally reduced by using mnemonics. And then, spreading out the memorization task still helps, so don't try to do everything at once. And timely review is still necessary to retain memories for the long term. Mnemonics lets you do miracles with your memory, according to Higby, but it still can't ignore the basic principles. Here's how Higby phrases it. Mnemonic systems aid the memory by supplementing strategies, not replacing them, just as with the basic principles of learning. We just saw how keywords use visual associations, and in fact all of the general mnemonic systems also use visual association. So let's dig a little deeper and see if we can't learn ways to make our visual associations more effective. The first thing to do is to make sure that our association is interactive. We don't want the 2 items we are associating to just sit there. We want them to interact. So, for example, we didn't just picture a duck and a pot. We pictured the duck wearing the pot like a hat, so there was more interaction. The way to get more vividness is to make sure there is plenty of detail and that you are seeing that detail. This is why I recommended a couple slides back that you close your eyes when creating an association. This is something I tell my students all the time, by the way. and they never do it. But I really think that closing my eyes helps, both when creating the association and then later when recalling it. There are several other specific ways to add vividness. First is to add motion to your association. My own version of the duck wearing a pot for a hat has the duck walking around, and of course the pot has slipped over its eye, so he bumps into things and quacks a lot. Second, use substitution. We didn't really do that here, but you might have imagined using a duck instead of a pot while cooking. Just open the duck's beak, pour in the soup, set the duck on the stove. A third way to make a visual association more vivid is to add exaggeration. Maybe have lots of ducks, a big flock, or a gigantic pot, and the duck is swimming around in it. One more way to make images more vivid is to make them familiar. You might think of Daffy Duck or Donald Duck, depending on which one seems more familiar to you. For my own visualization, I use a duck that a friend of mine has running around her yard. That duck has a certain personality that sticks out in my mind, so he's much more familiar and therefore more vivid. Now, last but not least, bizarreness is said to make visual associations more effective. I specifically worded that as is said to because memory training specialists like Harry Lorraine and many others recommend making images as bizarre as possible. But according to Higbee, it turns out that researchers haven't actually found a consistent benefit to more bizarre images. Maybe the benefit is just hard to detect. I'm still going to make my own associations as bizarre as possible because subjectively, I do think I remember better that way, and besides, it's just more fun. We have 3 questions that relate to the basic material on mnemonics still to answer. The first question is whether it's possible to use images for abstract material. How can you picture liberty or justice or happiness or education or salary or freedom? In cases such as these, use a concrete substitute word for the abstract word. Higbee suggests you think of the Liberty Bell for liberty. Think of a judge for justice. Think of a smiling face for happiness. Think of a schoolhouse for education. Alternatively, you could use a keyword. Remember, that means using a word that sounds like whatever you are trying to remember. So to remember the abstract idea of salary, think of a stalk of celery. Instead of the abstract idea of freedom, you could think of fried ham, which is much more concrete and generally more tasty besides. This keyword technique also works with nonsense syllables, by the way. The second question we still have to answer is whether you should make up your own mnemonics or use someone else's. The simple answer to this question is, it depends. On the one hand, if you make up your own mnemonics, then they'll be more vivid to you, which will help you remember. The disadvantage of making up your own mnemonics is it takes longer. In my own practice, I do both. For example, when I wanted to memorize the periodic table, I Googled and found what I expected to be a good mnemonic, but it really didn't work for me, so I changed most of it. When I wanted to memorize the U.S. presidents, I Googled and found what I expected to be a good mnemonic, and that's what I use. When I wanted to memorize the squares of all the numbers from 1 to 100, I Googled and found what I expected to be a good mnemonic, and found it to be worthless. So I invented my own. I'll mention, in passing, that my own mnemonics are very bizarre, so I could give you some excellent advice if you wanted to memorize the squares, but I wouldn't be able to share my mnemonics with you. The remaining question is what to do about verbal associations. Here, I'll just say that visual associations are much easier than verbal associations, since concrete memorization tasks are always easier than abstract ones, but I'll add that verbal associations get easier with practice, so keep trying. Thanks for watching. That's enough for this introduction to mnemonics.